Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, say the word whistleblower, and the first name that probably pops to your mind is Edward Snowden. He's the NSA contractor whose industrial-sized leak of top-secret government documents has made him one of the most wanted men in America. But my guest today, James Wasserstrom, blew his whistle at an even bigger target, you might say, the entire United Nations. Now, Wasserstrom was the UN's top anti-corruption officer in Kosovo back in 2007, when he warned his superiors about a lucrative kickback scheme linking UN officials to a local utility company. In return, he was arrested, sacked from his job, investigated, and treated like a pariah by an employer he had loyally served for nearly 3 decades. Now, more than 7 years later, well, he's here at our studios. Welcome.
Thank you.
The worst of your ordeal is behind you, but you say you are still watching and waiting closely for the UN to make good on what you say have really been empty promises to date to protect whistleblowers from retaliation. Are you making any progress? Are you any more hopeful today than 7 years ago?
No, in fact, I'm less hopeful than I was 7 years ago. It's the outcome of my case after 7 years of fighting it, which was to reject the lower court validation of my whistleblowing claim was a deep disappointment.
Your complaints initially went to an ethics panel, right, which essentially rejected them, right, said that they were reasonable but no real case.
Well, what happened was the UN has an office called the Ethics Office, which is designed to protect whistleblowers. And
right.
They initially said, yes, there is a valid claim there. It was investigated by the UN's Inspector General, and they said there wasn't any validity to my claim of whistleblowing. So we took it to court, the lower court, which validated, which supported me, and then that was overturned in a final and binding decision in August.
So this has been a real roller coaster ride, so to speak.
Yes, it has.
Now, there are, correct me if I'm wrong, there have been hundreds of whistleblowers, I think over 300 I read somewhere, people who have lodged complaints about misconduct within the UN. How come you've become known as the UN whistleblower? Why are you here today?
I think I'm the only one who's actually managed to get my case into the courtroom. And the others, unfortunately, their cases were blocked by various procedural and other means within the UN Ethics Office. So they never had the opportunity to bring it into to be heard in the UN justice system.
And how did you even uncover this? You were the top anti-corruption officer in Kosovo. But how did you uncover this? This was a $500 million kickback scheme. That's pretty lucrative.
That's correct. Well, it came out as in the course of my work overseeing the public utilities in Kosovo, and there was a power plant project that was going to be bid, and the value of that plant was about $5 billion. And the kickback that I started hearing about through informants and others was the 10% that you referred to, the $500 million. And since the names of my colleagues were mentioned in connection with receiving at least some of that kickback, right. This was an allegation. I reported to the UN's Inspector General. She, for whatever reason, it found its way into the hands of the individuals that I was accusing, and then I suffered egregious retaliation.
There was the retaliation return. Okay, we could go back to Plato. Who shall guard the guardians? Now you're complaining about the UN while being a UN officer while working within the UN. You actually had to enlist another ally in your fight to see reform in the UN. And surprisingly, you might say, it's the United States. Explain.
Well, I don't think that's surprising. I think the US
given the Edward Snowden, they haven't been sort of light-handed with him as a whistleblower.
But they do have, the U.S. does have very strong laws to protect whistleblowers within the federal government. Unfortunately, it didn't apply to Edward Snowden because he was a contractor and he was in the intelligence community, and hopefully one day that will also be rectified. But in my case, the U.S. Congress, both senators and congressmen, as well as Republicans and Democrats, were very supportive of my claim against the United Nations, and the fact that whistleblowers have been, in my view, persecuted within the UN system. So, in fact, in January of this year, the U.S. Congress passed a law, which was signed by President Obama, that 15% of all U.S. contributions to each and every UN agency shall be withheld if the UN doesn't adhere to whistleblower best practice.
Now, just to put that in perspective for our viewers, what you just said, this law would have the U.S. withdraw 15% of its contribution, and the U.S. is about a fifth of the UN's total budget in its contribution?
It's about a little more than 20% of the general budget and nearly 27% of the peacekeeping budget.
So the UN would ignore the United States at its own peril when it comes to this new law.
That was the hope.
And yet, we were speaking before this interview, and you were telling me that John Kerry, the Secretary of State, at least this year, he has certified the UN practices with regard to monitoring itself, its own whistleblowing practices. How's that?
He actually decided that the UN is, in fact, adhering to whistleblower best practices in the case of almost every UN agency, with 5 exceptions. But he certified that they were adhering to best practice, and therefore the entire funding was paid.
So what do you hope to do right now? I mean, I know that you want to see other countries pass similar laws, other member nations within 193 nations pass similar laws to withhold funding. What do you plan to do to sort of convince, I guess your goal is to convince John Kerry one of these years, next year perhaps, not to certify it?
That's correct. I think there are 2 different approaches. First is to encourage and work very hard with the State Department, which is the main interlocutor with the UN, to re-examine its position on whistleblower best practice within the United Nations, and I think that is easy to review. The harder part is, I think, to internationalize this particular movement, to get countries which are maybe not as sensitive to the whistleblowing issue to take it more seriously, because every international taxpayer, whether in France or Germany or elsewhere in the world, especially the major donors, has an interest in an effective organization, one that doesn't engage in fraud, waste, and abuse.
Now, you went on, you're not working there anymore, but you were also an anti-corruption officer in Kabul, in Afghanistan, for the U.S. Embassy.
That's correct.
Not for the United Nations. Did you uncover any misconduct there?
I'm afraid I'm not allowed to talk about my experience in Kabul.
You can't talk about it. I can't blow the whistle on you.
No, I'm afraid that
I had James Wasserstrom on my set, and he couldn't tell me about Afghanistan.
No, I'm afraid I can't talk about Afghanistan.
Fair enough. To get back to the UN, it's a giant bureaucracy. Everyone always talks about a sprawling, massive bureaucracy. Are you surprised that there's a lot of allegations of corruption and allegations of mismanagement of its budget?
Well, frankly, I was astonished when I was told that there were 400 individuals who had come forward. That, to me, is, and to the ethics office claiming whistleblower retaliation, this, to me, is far beyond any norm. So this reveals a very profound problem within the UN Secretariat.
So you would suspect that there are many similar cases, you just happen to discover this one, repeated throughout the UN global bureaucracy.
Yes, and in fact, because, as you've said, that I've become sort of the poster child for UN whistleblowing, I am in touch with whistleblowers. Many have come forward to me with really serious tales of wrongdoing and misconduct. And I have submitted some of those to members of Congress to demonstrate that it's not about me. It's about a serious problem that goes to the core of the UN's mission. And I think this translates into a broader problem within the UN, which is about transparency and accountability in general, and the culture of impunity that exists, which is extremely difficult to penetrate.
And you have said, I mean, this goes right up to the very top, right? Secretary General Ban Ki-moon himself, you said, I think you've actually said he tried to impede the inquiry into your allegations.
Well,
undermine it, perhaps.
I would say that. I informed him at many steps along the way during the crisis period when I was really under scrutiny, and after I'd been arrested and I had been investigated. And I was informing him all along of what I thought were missteps and why was this happening to me. And he did not intervene when he could. I was informing him of missteps by very senior people, and he ignored all of it. And in the end, he was, to say the least, unhelpful.
And yet he continues to maintain that the UN is doing its utmost to adhere to the best standard practice when it comes to whistleblowing. Protecting whistleblowers.
I mean, that is ridiculous. To me, that is completely untrue. 400 people come forward, and of those 400, the ethics office only looks into 100 and then actually takes a second look, a serious look at only 12 of those. And my case demonstrates that each one of the accountability institutions of the United Nations, whether it's the Inspector General, the ethics office, or the internal justice system of the UN, each one put to the test and each one failed.
Each one failed. Now, I understand you said this is not about you. This is about the larger issue of trying to get the UN to reform its practices. But just to talk about you in the little time we have left, you had claimed quite a lot in damages, millions, and you've received a pittance.
I received nothing.
I thought you got about $60,000.
That was overturned in the appeal.
That was overturned. So today you have absolutely nothing to show for what you went through.
That's correct in terms of dollars. I think in terms of the value to me as a person in fighting for my integrity is immeasurable.
So at this point, your particular case closed, that's it. And we're not going to hear anything more about James Wasserstrom's case. You're hoping for something on a larger level about whistleblowing.
That's correct. I think what we'll do now is we've taken this to the U.S. Congress. They are sympathetic. I'm sure that there will be some discussions with the executive branch of the U.S. government, as well as working with the media internationally to bring this cause to the attention of international taxpayers who have deep pockets financing the UN across Europe and elsewhere in the world.
And finally, do you think maybe it might take a new Secretary General of the UN to make things really change?
I would like to see that one of the litmus tests for the candidates for Secretary General be their record in fighting corruption from the countries from which they come, since very often these people are very senior political figures. Let's see how they've done at home before we make them the international champion.
So we're going to leave it in a watching and waiting mode. James Wasserstrom, a former anti-corruption top officer in the UN mission in Kosovo, who's had quite an ordeal over the past 7 years, trying to force the UN to stand up to its pledges to protect whistleblowers. Thank you very much for being our guest today.
My pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for watching the interview here on France 24. More news ahead.